It's late in the evening. You're driving along heading for home when you spot a light further down the road. It's bright and you assume that it's another car. You flash your high beams hoping to get its attention, but it does not respond. As you draw nearer to it, you realize that it's not an inconsiderate driver, but something out of your scope of understanding. There's something there sitting on the road. It does not appear to be of this world. Suddenly your vehicle stalls and strange figures emerge and begin moving in your direction. A game of cat and mouse ensues. Join me as I delve into the strange case of Maximiliano Iglesias Sanchez. Maximiliano Iglesias Sanchez was a 21-year-old truck driver living in Leganilla in Spain. He garnered some attention when his story of encountering entities on a road over the course of 2 evenings was featured in a Spanish magazine. What makes his case so interesting is that it was actually investigated by officers from the Civil Guard, who did seem to find some evidence that something strange had landed on the road where Sanchez claimed. Granted, I don't want to get ahead of myself, so let's start at the beginning. It was the night of March 20th, 1974. Sanchez, tired from a long day of hauling material, was driving his rig past the village of Horcajo on his way back to his home in Leganilla. He observed a very bright white light further down the road. He estimated that it was about 2,000 feet ahead on the highway. He initially assumed it was another vehicle. He flipped his headlights to high beam several times in hopes of notifying the other driver to dim his own lights. The other driver did not respond, and the bright light remained almost blinding in its intensity. It was so brilliant, in fact, that Sanchez was forced to pull his truck to the side of the road. He watched as the bright light suddenly dimmed to about the power of a 50-watt bulb. He thought maybe the other driver had finally figured out what he was signaling, and he decided to carry on driving, heading towards the light. When Sanchez was about 600 feet away, he discovered that the light was not attached to another automobile, but rather something very odd. Then, without warning, all the lights on his truck went out and the motor stopped. The area was illuminated only by the now dim light of something that resembled a large disc. Sanchez noted that the object had a metallic structure of either platinum or steel. It seemed quite solid, and it had smooth edges without rivets or openings of any kind. It was 30 to 36 feet in diameter and rested about 5 feet off the ground on 3 round landing pads. It was a light like he'd never seen before, Sanchez noted, adding that it seemed to be uniform on all surfaces of the metallic craft. He continued to examine it and was caught off guard by the realization that there was not one, but 2 crafts there. Above and about 50 feet to the right of the first was another similar craft. As if from nowhere, 2 human-like figures appeared in front of the grounded craft. They seemed to move in unison and began motioning to each other, quote, like the tourists do. They looked over at Sanchez and one of the figures pointed at him. With that, one of the humanoids turned around and disappeared to the right of the first object, while the other stayed, watching Sanchez. After a short wait, the other being returned and stood beside his partner. The 2 entities looked at each other, then both walked off to the right of the craft out of sight of Sanchez. Then the craft slowly rose in the air with a slight humming sound. Sanchez described the entities as standing about 6 feet tall and wearing brightly lit, close-fitting coveralls. The material seemed to be made of rubber and had almost the same brilliance as the ship they were standing in front of. It did not seem as though the clothes were reflecting the ship's light, but rather, they seemed to be giving off their own light. The figures, he noted, appeared to be human-like in that the arms and legs seemed proportional to a regular human, and their manner of walking was also, quote, normal, not like that of a robot or how one might expect a visitor from another planet to walk. Sadly, as hard as Sanchez tried, he could not describe their facial features. Granted, the sighting took place at night, and he was never closer than 600 feet to the entities. When the first object reached the altitude of the second object, the two of them remained motionless, hovering in the air. Sanchez decided that he should leave, and this time his truck started back up again without any issues. The lights flickered back to life. He drove down the road a short way when he suddenly got the feeling that he should stop. He wanted to get another look at them. Sanchez stopped his truck and climbed down from the cab to study them. He noticed that the illuminated ship had dropped down to the site where it had been before. At this point, and for the first time, Sanchez became afraid. An overwhelming sense of fear took hold, and he quickly climbed back inside his truck and took off, driving as fast as he could down that stretch of highway. He did not stop his truck again until he reached home. Then, uncharacteristically, he went straight to bed, skipping his dinner. The next morning, Sanchez told the story to his neighbors, but found that they were less than receptive. They simply did not believe his story. He also told some co-workers and discovered that the son of his employer had heard a similar story involving a commercial traveler who encountered a weird object and its strange occupants along a road near Seville. That afternoon, March 21st, Sanchez drove to Pineda to deliver a load of construction material. While there, he stopped in at the home of Anuncia Marino, a girl he had been dating. He told Anuncia and her family what had happened the previous evening, and they took it very seriously, even insisting that he stay at their place overnight and just drive home in the morning. It was getting late, and they felt it would not be safe to drive home down that road after dark. Sanchez elected not to heed their advice, but he probably should have. He began his journey, heading back down that same stretch of road in the direction of his home in Lagunilla. At about 11:15 p.m., he found himself coming upon the site of the previous night's UFO encounter. Like a repeat of the night before, he again saw a bright light ahead of him. This time he did not think it was the light from a passing vehicle. He knew what it was. He decided to keep going, even if it was the visitors. He was certain they weren't much interested in him. Had they wanted to do something to him, he reasoned, they would have done it the first night, but they didn't. Again, he drove to within about 600 feet of the light. This time, however, he realized that there were 3 of them. As before, the truck lights went out and the engine quit, this time with a backfire. One of the objects was sitting on the highway, while the other 2 were just off the road, to the right side of Sanchez, one behind the other. All 3 were illuminated with the same dim light he had observed the previous evening. As he watched, 4 figures suddenly appeared and walked to the center of the craft resting on the highway. The 4 looked directly at Sanchez as though studying him. They seemed to be communicating with each other through gestures. The beings pointed at Sanchez, then started walking in his direction. Sanchez immediately sensed that he was in great danger and jumped out of his truck and began running down the road. He peered back and observed that the 4 figures had increased their pace and appeared to be moving very fast. Sanchez took off across the field and noticed that these figures seemed to be closing the gap between him and them. Sanchez spotted a small ditch filled with mud, and he decided to run towards it. He jumped down into the muck and watched as the beings wandered further into the field, past his position. His plan to hide in the ditch seemed to work. He remained perfectly still, watching as the beings circled about in the field. Strangely, even though they got to within 50 feet of him, Sanchez still could not make out facial features, a matter that bothered him greatly when he reported the incident. After a short time, the entities seemed to give up and began making their way out of the field back towards the road. Sanchez waited until everything quieted down and he felt as though it was safe to leave. Not wanting to go back to the road, he began making his way through the fields towards the town of Horcajo. He soon could see the lights of the town off in the distance. He estimated that it was about a mile away. He sat down and smoked a cigarette to calm his nerves. He rested for another 10 minutes and then, because he did not want to leave his truck on the road, turned around and headed back. He assumed that enough time had passed and that the visitors would probably be long gone. He was wrong. As he neared his truck, now walking on the road, he could see the 3 crafts still sitting there. He examined the area and noticed that the figures were no longer around. He thought that they must have returned to their craft. He quietly went back to his truck. He found the door closed. This bothered him. He remembered that he had left it open when he departed earlier. He slowly and cautiously crept up to the door, fearing that one of these figures might be inside, waiting for him. He opened it and discovered that nobody was in the cab. He tried to start the engine but found it still wouldn't work. As he shut the door, the 4 entities appeared in the middle of the road, as before, gesturing to one another. Sanchez feared that this time, if they wanted to take him, he would not be able to stop them. Strangely, that is not what happened. He watched as the 4 figures went to the right side of the object parked there and apparently entered it just before it climbed to an altitude of about 50 feet. The same low humming sound was heard, but it stopped as soon as the object came to rest hovering in the sky. Sanchez got the sense that the beings had moved their craft in order to clear the road for him and allow him to pass. They had done it the previous night, but it was only now that it really clicked for Sanchez that their craft was somehow interfering with his truck's ability to stay running, and it was required that they manually move their craft for him to keep going. The truck started instantly this time and the lights came on. Sanchez drove away, though his curiosity got the better of him. He did not feel the extreme fear he felt the night before, or even an hour ago. He stopped his truck about 600 feet down the road, climbed down from his cab, and began walking back to where the UFOs were. The one that had lifted from the highway to let him pass was once again in place on the asphalt paving. He hid in a clump of bushes about 30 feet away. The 4 entities had re-emerged from the craft and he could see them wandering around. Sanchez examined the nearest craft to see if he could see some opening in it through which the beings were coming and going, but all he could see were unbroken walls. He watched the beings at work. They were using 2 tools that resembled a horseshoe and the letter T. They inserted the T into the ground at the embankment of the highway. Then they would withdraw the instrument and insert the horseshoe device into the hole. He noted that they did not appear to be taking mineral or vegetation samples. Even at this very close range, Sanchez still could not make out any facial features on the entities. He remained there for about 3 minutes when that feeling of fear returned. This time it was overwhelming, and despite the fact that the beings never looked in his direction, or even seemed to be aware that he was there, he felt as though he was in great danger. He knew that it was time to leave. He immediately turned and headed back down the road towards his truck. When he reported the incident to his boss the next day, he was advised to contact the civil guard, which he did, accompanied by his employer's son. The officer in charge contacted headquarters in Bajar, and after 3 days an officer arrived and filed a report. Sanchez was interviewed and investigators went to the alleged landing site, where they found some strange tracks. On the highway where the craft was said to have landed, the investigators found a deep, straight groove, as if the asphalt had been scored by a very hard object. On the embankment, the investigators found 2 scratches that seemed to substantiate Sanchez's story about tools. Sadly, this was all the physical evidence the investigators found to indicate that the craft and its occupants had been there. A few days later, 2 individuals from Madrid arrived in Lagunilla, stating that they were UFO investigators. They were equipped with instruments for making tests, including a Geiger counter. The team, trained in such investigative matters, was successful in finding 3 circles that appeared to have been caused by the craft resting there. The grass was pressed down, but no indentation from the landing gear could be found. Abnormal radioactivity in the area was recorded by the Geiger counter. Curiously, Sanchez added that although his truck started that night, the battery was completely dead the next morning. When he had it recharged, the garage mechanic could detect nothing abnormal about the battery. The strange sightings did not stop there, however. On March 30th, Sanchez was again with his girlfriend in Pineda. It was around 12:45 a.m. when they saw what looked like 2 large spotlights in the sky at about 2,800 feet. The spots of very bright light were flying over the area, and they gave every indication of being similar to the UFOs witnessed by Sanchez earlier that month. The 4th and final sighting took place in early May of the same year, while Sanchez was with his girlfriend and her uncle. They had gone to the city of Salamanca, his hometown, to take a driving exam. It was around 6:30 a.m. when Anuncia caught sight of a strong white light in the sky, which soon disappeared. A few miles down the road, they saw another bright light. This time it was coming directly toward them at an extremely high rate of speed. Anuncia began to panic, fearing that it was going to slam into them head-on. About 300 feet before the impact, the light changed direction, passed over their car, and disappeared. It did not return. Sanchez would have no more sightings of UFOs. He gained some level of notoriety when journalist Angel Gomez Escorial wrote of his encounter in the Spanish magazine Black and White. Escorial spoke with Sanchez and found him to be quite believable. Maximiliano Iglesias Sanchez does not seem very imaginative. If he is lying, he does it to perfection, noted Escorial. In a bid to put the whole thing behind him, Sanchez joined the army. Sanchez's case is interesting not only because of what was found during the follow-up investigation, but what transpired during his 2 encounters. So much of what occurred strikes me as just odd, and it leaves me to wonder if Sanchez was really in control of his actions. On both nights, Sanchez managed to get away, only to stop and head back. On the 2nd night, he did this twice. 3 times if you count the fact that he ended up on the same road the very next night, after experiencing what he experienced. While Sanchez indicated fear at various points during the encounter, it seemed to come and go. This seemed to happen whenever he examined the craft and the occupants too intently. He does not say what he saw scared him, only that he was suddenly overcome with fear, as if the thought had been inserted into his mind as a means to shoo him away. I'm not saying that these beings were speaking telepathically, which seems to be the modus operandi of these visitors in most of these cases, as there are aspects of his encounter that suggest otherwise. When he was being chased in the field, he indicated that the visitors actually seemed to lose him, spending a great deal of time circling the area trying to find him. Had they been able to telepathically link to Sanchez, that it seems very unlikely that they would lose him, unless of course that link is only established when the visitors are able to see the witnesses. To me, Sanchez's case almost feels like a strange game of cat and mouse, and I was left to wonder if the entire event was designed as an experiment to gauge the fear reaction of Sanchez. Maybe the visitors knew exactly where he was in the field. Maybe they were the ones who kept having him return. And maybe they had in a sense programmed him to return the very next night to continue their experiment. When they were done, they simply moved their craft, allowing him to leave. Granted, I'm just speculating. It's possible that they had every intention of abducting him on the 2nd night, and who knows, maybe they did. See, the one thing about Sanchez's experience that really stands out to me is what happened on the 1st night, when Sanchez returned home. It was noted that he was behaving oddly, even skipping dinner. In many abductee reports, they describe feeling ill, feeling thirsty after they are returned. I do wonder if something else may have happened to Sanchez on that first night. He recalls seeing one of the beings pointing at him, followed by them leaving. But is that what really happened? Given that these events happened nearly 50 years ago, I doubt we'll ever know. Anyways, that's this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed.